Hi there, Frank Winston here for the Pacifica Historical Society and host of our show, Footprints of Pacifica, where we explore and discover some of the lure and lore of lovely Pacifica, its character and its characters. Tonight's show is on the history of memories of Sharp Park, the area which will be shown in a video in a moment or two, but which has been historic in the realms of Pacifica. Our guest in the studio later will be Mark, and before he comes, I want to show from this channel many years ago some reflections of Sharp Park with Julia Gervais and Dima Savage. So let's roll the tape.
By the rivers of Babylon,
it's always fascinating for me, Julie, to talk to people who were born on the coast side long before this was the city of Pacifica. And you were born in 1912 in
a place called Babylonia.
And in English, folks, yes.
Babylon.
Babylon. And Julie said to me when we first met today at noontime, well, I was born in Babylon. And my face was a complete blank, and she said, I'm sure she was thinking, some historian you are, you don't know where Babylon was. Babylon turns out to be a place
way back in Pedro Valley, and it was so remote. That's the only reason I think they named it that.
It called it Babylon. This picture that we have on the tripod, we've had on the show before, and it, of course, is a picture of Salada Beach, now present-day Sharp Park. It was taken about the year you were born, Julie. This picture was taken about the year 1915, between 1910 and 1915. And, of course, in the background on this picture, I'm going to point out a place that Julie, after she was born in Babylon, moved to. And this, of course, was the Comerford Fahey Estate. And this was the big house that stood on the coast side, built in 1892 by Joseph Michael Comerford. And so we had a good time today talking about the Comerford house, your father as a farmer, and we're getting a little ahead of the story because your father farmed in Babylon too, did he not?
Yes, before we moved to the Fahey Estate.
What did they grow on the farm back in
Mostly artichokes.
Mostly artichokes.
Brussels sprouts, potatoes and cabbage. Things like that, but mostly artichokes.
And you lived back in Babylon, and then you moved out to the Comerford house when you were about four?
About 3, 4.
3 or 4, again. And this, of course, is what the countryside looked like when you moved out of the valley, out of Babylonia, out to the Fahey place, as you called it, rather than the Comerford place. This is another picture that maybe can give a better feeling for how lonely and how really far apart the farms were on the coast side at the turn of the century. This picture was taken again in 1905, and it's taken from the top of Talbot Avenue. If you were standing up where Sharp Park Road makes the turn round, and you can get out of your car and look out at Pacifica down below you, this is what you would have seen were you standing there at the turn of the century. And in the background, although you cannot see it really well in this picture, is the Comerford Fahey Estate with all of those lovely big trees, Julie.
Oh, if I could only see it now.
Tell me what it looked like when you moved there.
Well, as my childish memories, of course, there was an area of about 4 city blocks surrounded by trees, and the front of the place was just a mass of beautiful flowers. It was a great, big, beautiful mansion, and our place, of course, was not the same. It was just an old place, but
it was a farmer's house on the grounds. Is
just
that true?
about a block from hers. And in that same grove of trees.
Oh, so
it was beautiful.
Yes.
Just beautiful. And we could hear the sound of the ocean at night. I'll never forget that.
I'm sure, because
waves.
it really was on the
by the ocean.
Cliffs by the ocean, bounded by the county road. In this longer picture, if I can take this away so the cameraman can zoom in again, here's the Comerford Estate that we're speaking of back here in the background. And of course, the county road ran parallel to the beach area all the way down the coast side.
In front of the
Yes, in front of the estate. And this was the house that you moved to when you were, this is not the house, but these are the grounds.
Yes, just to the right of it over here somewhere.
Yes, and there is a house back here, and then there's a barn, there's a water tower.
Yeah, I remember that.
And the big 9-room, 5-bedroom house that had a library. It was a big, rather sumptuous
Very
house.
impressive, very impressive.
It was built by Joseph Michael Comerford, and as we talked today, Julie, it's one of those interesting times when entrepreneurs in San Francisco had often picked out country estates, either on the coast side or on the bay side. Of course, we know many more of them on the bay side today because the really Powers, the big Huntingtons and the Crockers and
Stanfords.
yes, and the Lelands and all of that all went to the other side, on the bay side, but we had one of those, and his name was Joseph Michael Comerford.
The name was new to me.
Well, because
I was so small.
Yes, and you knew the lady of the manse, the lady of the manor, as
Yes,
Lydia
and her
Fahey,
mother.
and her mother. And Lydia Fahey, of course, that was her married name, because she was Lydia Comerford, one of the Comerford children. Joseph Michael Comerford built the house in 1892 as a summer home. It was never really a working ranch on 110 acres. The house and the grounds, as you can see, occupied 9 acres. And the trees were planted by an old, or at the behest of an old family friend, John McLaren.
That was news to me, too.
Yes, that name may strike a bell with you since he was the father of Golden Gate Park. When you came down and you lived in this house that's out in this grove of trees here, you walked to the nearby school, which of course
It's the San Pedro School.
was the San Pedro School. The picture that you brought along, which we find charming, charming picture. Now, if this one doesn't turn up really good, we're going to switch the pictures on the tripod because I want you to see it. It's a lovely picture. And Julie, I'd like you to tell the people out there who we're seeing. We're on the grounds of the Comerford estate right
Yes.
here in this picture,
Oh,
right?
I'm sure it is. And this is a picture of the family.
Oh,
The only one that's missing is the baby of the family.
the baby. But
And he
you,
is 65 now.
but you are in the picture.
Yes, here I am.
Right there's Julie.
This is my oldest brother, Guido. This is August. This is Nellie. This is Blanche. There's my mom holding Romeo. Romeo and Juliet.
Aha.
That's my dad.
Oh, he looks like he's enjoying life with a
Sitting
glass
on a
of
barrel drinking a glass
yes,
of wine.
a homemade glass of wine.
Yes.
Yes.
That's my oldest sister and her husband.
Uh-huh. Julie, you were telling me about making wine on the farm. Tell me about it.
Oh, that was a yearly affair. We'd get
Uh-huh.
a couple of tons of grapes, you know, in the city. And
Now, you didn't grow the grapes.
no,
You
no,
bought
we
them.
bought them down in the produce market, and they'd eventually get it to the ranch some way or other by truck, I imagine. And we'd crush it and then put it into these great big vats and wait for it to ferment.
Is this one of the barrels that you would put the wine in, do you
Yes,
suppose, in
50-gallon
here?
barrels, 50-gallon. Yes.
So you made your own wine, and you've brought a smaller picture that may be a little more difficult for the camera to pick up, but we can't not show it to you folks because it too has a little story in it. We're going to put it right here and use this as a backing, and we won't keep it up long because it isn't a really clear picture and it's a small picture to start with. But if the camera's on it now, tell me what this is, Julie. I love this.
That's where my mom baked her bread, great big loaves.
Now, this looks like a house to me, Julie. How can you bake bread in a house?
Well, there was a brick oven in there.
Inside the little frame house. Did every ranch in this area, or the ones that you knew of, have its own baking kind
I'm
of oven
pretty sure.
outside?
I can't see how they would have to go to town every other day for bread, you know.
But you see, being present-minded myself and somewhat younger and don't have that in my background, I would think that you would cook inside in the kitchen. You would have a big range and you'd make bread.
No.
No.
We just had a wood stove, you know, and that's where my mom cooked. There was no gas in those days.
No.
And the bread was made out there, and she had these great big pallets that she put them into the oven.
Like a long stick with a big round
with the
thing
big
on it?
round paddle at the end of it, and then pull the loaves out after they were made, and they were about this big,
Oh,
that
my.
thick, you know. Beautiful bread. Ooh,
Oh,
good.
sounds good. Makes me hungry. I want a glass of her father's wine and a big hunk of her mother's crusty bread.
And some
don't you?
cheese she used to make.
Cheese. They made their own cheese as well.
Yes,
Oh, your mother was a very busy lady, wasn't she?
she was.
Did your mother make the bread the night before and punch it all down and wait?
Actually, I don't remember the process, but I know they had what they called a starter. And every time they'd have to use that for the next batch.
That was
of
their
bread.
yeast to
yes, I imagine.
liven the bread.
And
Did she
I
sell the
imagine
bread, or is this
no,
just
no,
for your
no,
own
it was just
family?
for their own use. She'd make about a dozen loaves, and then when those were gone, she'd make another batch.
Oh,
It was a lot of work.
I'd say. Romeo had an unfortunate incident happen
Oh,
in his
yes.
lifetime.
We often played with Willie Fay. I did too.
This is Lydia Comerford Fahey's only son, William.
And one day they went to the dam on the Raffanti Ranch, it was called at the time.
Which is deep in what we now call Fairway Park, past the shooting range.
Out near the Sharp Park Road. And they went swimming there, but something happened, and he was drowned along with another.
Willie Fahey was drowned.
Yes, along with the other boy who tried to save him, I think.
There were three then.
Yes. My brother lived, and he ran for miles to the ranch, to the nearest place for help.
And this was Lydia Comerford Fahey's only son.
Yes.
Having lost her husband early in their marriage when this boy was still an infant. Lydia continued to live at the ranch, though, until she was quite an elderly lady. She was a very interesting woman, one of those civic activists early in the game when it really wasn't the popular thing for a woman to do. She was very active in the school district. She was active, I think she was on the school board at one time, and she was very active in her own Catholic Church circle. And there is a funny story about during the 20s and 30s, evidently, at the Comerford Ranch, which was still, of course, Lydia's home in those days, she had summer sort of retreats for the orders of nuns that were part of her.
I didn't know that.
Yes, and people would say that it was quite fun to look down at the beach and see the nuns with their habits up around their knees, cavorting in the surf. And I think that probably it would please her today to know that there is a Catholic church on her former ranch grounds, the former grounds that your father farmed. That was the area that your father farmed,
Yes.
directly in front of the ranch. Isn't that true?
Yes, true.
Now, your sister stayed at the ranch even after the rest of
Yes,
the family
for quite
left.
a few years, yes. Raising her family.
And you told me something interesting about what she did at the Oceana, where Oceana is today.
Oh, yes. From there, in later years, she went to the Pappas Nursery there, and they raised flowers, and
That's
worked
the whole
there.
slope where
Yes.
Oceana School is today and comes down to the freeway by the tennis courts. That used to all be the Pappas Nurseries where they grew flowers. And your sister, what was your sister's name?
Rose,
Rose, and her last name?
Rovi.
Rovi, Rose Rovi. Did they live on the coast side then for many years after you left?
Quite a few, yes. And then we didn't say about Mrs. Fay, we went berry picking with her.
Oh, yes, of course.
We'd walk up the coast road,
Yes.
and in those days the road was quite narrow and treacherous, you know, but we managed. We
What kind
hiked.
of berries?
I think they were blackberries.
Blackberries. I know that strawberries grow on the headlands around
Either that or
Point
raspberries. I'm
Point
not
San
sure
Pedro.
now.
But she took children out on walks
Yes,
and things
yes.
then. Well, that was nice. That's a nice memory. This is what the Comerford house looked like shortly before it was burned. It was destroyed. It was burned deliberately in an exercise for the Sharp Park Volunteer Fire Department after it was condemned. There was an effort on Grace McCarthy's part, as she has told me, to try to find someone on the coast side and even at the county to become interested in saving this house, because it of course would have been the oldest structure in town, having been built in 1892, or one of the oldest structures in town. There were of course farmhouses, and this is one of those farmhouses. This is the Fahey farmhouse. I don't want to steal thunder from the Comerford house here. Thank you, Julie. This is the Fahey farmhouse, and this is where William Fahey's family rented land and farmed up in Carmel Canyon. But Grace tells me that she tried to get people interested in saving this building because it was so old and it sat in a perfectly lovely grove of trees planted by John McLaren. But unfortunately, the time was not right. People's consciousness was not raised to the point where they were really terribly interested in that at that time in the restoration, the renovation, the saving of our historic sites. So that I'm sorry, Julie, that you can't come back today and visit the site of some really happy times when you were a girl. But at least we do have some nice pictures that we can share and stories that you can share with us.
I'm sure glad to have that one, because I've been looking for something like that.
Yes. So maybe this is a good time then for us to sort of leave off our story. And it's been wonderful talking to you, Julie, about living on the coast side.
I'd like to backtrack to the building of the Fahey place, because when it was built and when the trees were planted, the trees were acquired and planted from the Golden Gate Park gardener
John
McLaren, yeah. And when they were delivered down to the ranch, McLaren planted a pine tree on one side of the entrance and a cypress tree on the other side to show the workmen how deep the hole should be dug and how it should be fertilized and watered before the new plants were set in place, so that the trees that were on the property were planted under his supervision. And the ones along the west coast, right along the edge of the cliff with the cypress trees, they formed a windbreak. A little bit to the inshore side were the pine trees, and they, under the protection of the cypress trees, flourished to a rather respectable height. And then the gardens, the flower gardens and peach trees that she had and other trees could be planted and have a reasonable chance of existing in spite of the fact that they were located so near the coast. I don't know if you, Grace, do you remember the Easter lilies that were planted in her front yard? That would be right up against the highway.
I just remember the roses.
Roses, oh, not Easter, well, no, not Callan, cove lilies. The cove lily is like an Easter lily, but it's a larger white blossom. And there was about, I'd say, 3/4 of an acre of ground in front and was planted with those. And not only a beautiful sight, but very fragrant as well.
It's been a long time coming. It's going to be a long time gone.
Here we are in the studio with Mark Clausen and a follow-up on the memories of Sharp Park. Since we were referring to Sharp Park, how did it get its name, Mark?
Well, it got its name from this lovely lady, Honora Sharp. And she and her husband, George, was a rather wealthy lawyer, but he dropped dead in 1882 in a San Francisco courtroom. So after he dropped dead, he left her very well off. And she never had any children, and upon her death, which is when this picture was printed in the Call Bulletin in 1905, they found in her will that she had donated the golf course area that is today's Sharp Park Golf Course to the city of San Francisco, but it had to be used for recreational purposes. And so what happened around 1930 was the Salada Beach and the Brighton Beach communities got together and decided to be called Sharp Park.
The golf course had already been started.
No, the golf course wasn't started until actually 1929.
Okay.
And it was completed around 1930. The designer was a Dr. Alistair McKenzie, who designed the golf course. And the site was spectacular because, of course, the lagoon was there and the ocean, and you had the backdrop of the hills. And then that fella John McLaren, who you may have heard about earlier, he did all
In
the
the video.
landscaping.
Right.
So we actually have the same landscaping at that golf course.
How would you describe Sharp Park boundaries? In other words, to the pier and the ocean.
Well, to the people that live here today, it would be really from where Sharp Park Golf Course is, would be the southern boundary. And then the northern boundary would be up by Good Shepherd Church, roughly, and on the east side of the highway. And on the west side, it would be about where the recycling plant and the wrecking yard that used to be there. And then out to the pier on the west, and then going back up to the top at, say, Talbot and back in the back of Canyon and Carmel. That would be the very east end of, actually Sharp Park Road is almost the
And
border.
Mark, you use most of the features of Sharp Park, you and your family.
Oh yeah, I have 6 children, and I've had a marvelous time here enjoying the pier. You go fishing, not that we ever really always catch anything, but lots of other people do. And my boys have had fun with putting in the crab net, and then bicycling, of course, along our promenade, and then out along the levee. And then we had horses out at Maury Point at one time, and we could ride all the way along the beach, all the way down to Muscle Rock, which is down by Manor. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, you've got the hiking areas going up along the ridges here. So, it's a marvelous place to raise a family.
From this book about the history of Pacifica, I've got a couple of photographs. Show them, see what you recognize there.
Okay. Well, here we have out at Maury Point, there used to be a house. And if you were to go out there today, the house is no longer there. And when I came here around 1976, really the only portion was this back part you see. And today, so much of the erosion has occurred that even where this house sits, a portion of this house would be on the beach at this point because it's eroded.
So,
and then these are the little cottages that made up Salada Beach. They were summer homes for people that would come down from San Francisco.
these were of the Craftsman style, and they were built in the early 1900, 1910.
Yeah, they were little 25-foot wide lots.
But they're still lived in today.
Yes, yes.
And let's try one more page here.
The
The
little
stores.
market, yes. It was the old county road that went along there, which is now Palmetto. And that's at the kind of near the corner of Palmetto and Brighton. The market, unfortunately, was one of the oldest markets here in town, but it recently closed a year or so ago.
And is Anderson's in this page?
No, Anderson's is on I believe, the next page here, Frank. And Anderson's is a marvelous place. I love going there for coffee in the morning. There's a lovely little, it's called the Salada Cafe, I believe. I always call it the Little Red Cafe because of the color of the building.
Okay. I want to talk about the incident in the 1980s, the storm that broke up Sharp Park. Tell us what you recall about that.
Well, I remember taking my oldest son.
What?
I remember taking my oldest son, Mark, down to enjoy that storm, and I think there's some footage of that.
Video.
The storm was probably one of the most awe-inspiring things I've ever experienced here. My son, I was at the time working in construction. There wasn't much construction going on due to the storms. We were rained out, so I took my son, Mark, who at the time was not quite 4 years old. And the wind was blowing so strong that the sand whipping in off the beach, because there was no promenade there at the time. And there were these 3 little homes just south of the pier that sat right on the beach. And the beach is not like it is today. The beach was much larger, but when this storm came in, we watched as it ripped up the asphalt and would throw it across the street into the buildings that exist there now. And then at the same time, they had to come and cut the wires and the utilities from those houses because they literally got dragged into the ocean. And my son, I remember he was so little, the wind blew so hard if I let go of him, it would literally blow him over and the sand would cut into your skin and your face. So it was...
Did we lose people as well as buildings?
As
in the
far as I
storm?
know, we didn't lose any people, but we did lose the 3 little buildings that were south of the pier. And then there was a 4th building that was right down where the levee begins. And they put... They took and put metal shielding down in to try to stop it, but a couple years later that was torn down as well.
And of the parts that you remember most, the highlights, you would say, of Sharp Park, the more recent Sharp Park, is that you're working on the redevelopment of some area there. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, we're looking at the feasibility of how to make the area along Palmetto in West Sharp Park more conducive to the people that live there and also to people that come to visit. To try to revitalize that little area of businesses that are there and make it just a place that Pacificans can hopefully enjoy.
Well, that area also made the news a couple of times with the USS Johnson, which was before your time, but you want to tell a little what you know about that
Well,
one?
yeah, the poor captain lost his ship was what it really boiled down to, and his whole livelihood ended up getting washed up onto the Sharp Park beach, and it made national news.
It was a destroyer escort.
You know, I don't remember exactly what type of ship it was.
But it landed here and
it landed
could do
here,
nothing.
and that was the end of that ship's career.
And then Santa Claus landed here one time. Let's talk about that one.
Well, that made international news. Yes, Santa was going to come and literally end up in Eureka Square. And at the time, Highway 1 was not in, and so it was just more or less a two-lane road. The problem was they hadn't taken into account the wind that day. And so the wind blew Santa into the ocean. And as rumor went, they hauled him out, rescued him, and gave him a little stiffener at Winter's Bar.
Thank you, Mark Clausen, for sharing with us your notes about the memories of Sharp Park. And remember, lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and in parting, leave behind us footprints in the sands of time. Now, I'm supposed to keep talking to you.